Welcome to the Cornell Cooperative Extension Dairy Herd Health Troubleshooting Podcast, a podcast series focused on how to go about looking into health issues on a dairy. Each episode will discuss a different area on the dairy where herd health can be impacted. This series has less to do with providing answers to problems. We'll be talking about how to be more successful in your investigations.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to another one of our podcast episodes. My name is Casey Havekes. I am one of the dairy management specialists on the North Country Regional Ag team. This episode is put together by myself as well as Betsy Hicks, who is a dairy management specialist on the South Central New York Dairy and Field Crops team, as well as Dave Balbian, who is a dairy specialist on the Central New York Dairy and Field Crops program. On this episode, we are going to discuss troubleshooting feeding behavior. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Trevor DeVries. Trevor is a professor in the Department of Animal Biosciences at the University of Guelph, where he has a large research focus on dairy cattle welfare and feeding behavior. Welcome, Trevor, and thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me.
So why don't we jump right in? My first question for you is, say a farmer is walking along the feed bunk. What type of feeding behavior should they be watching out for and why?
Good question. So practically, I guess when we look at cows and what they're doing at the feed bunk, we not only want to make sure that they're eating the feed that we put in front of them, but think about how those cows are eating their feed and what they're actually consuming. And so one of the things that producers can look for is just the way that they're consuming the feed and the way that they approach the feed bunk. I always make the comment that like when we provide new feed or we push up feed, if the cows come running and they start eating like crazy, again, some may take that as a good sign. They're being aggressive and they're eating. But if the cows are showing that much kind of interest in the feed, that probably tells you that those cows are hungry. And what you see then is you see kind of these cows slug feeding at that point, having a very large meal, eating very quickly. And the reason why that can be concerning is that if cows do that too much, they're going to consume too much feed too quickly. That can then have a negative impact on their ruminant environment. And those large meals get digested fairly quickly, particularly the highly fermentable carbohydrates within those meals. And as a result of that, rumen pH gets potentially depressed. And with that, fiber digestibility gets depressed. And those things can then have negative impacts then on, say, passage rate from the rumen, overall digestibility, even influence the risk of milk fat depression. And so that's potentially problematic. And same thing goes for not only how the cows eat, but also what the cows eat. And one of the probably even more easily noted things when someone's walking the feed bunk is to look at what cows are actually consuming and if they're sorting their feed. And when we feed cows TMR, the idea is that the cows eat the diet as it's put in front of them, the mixture that we formulate and mix and actually put in front of those cows. But cows are pretty adept at picking through what they like and eating a diet that might not be exactly what put in front of them. And when we watch cows do that, and if we watch them sort, you see them digging down and see them getting to the bottom and pushing that feed around. They're trying to sort out the parts that they like. And what happens when cows sort is basically they end up consuming a diet that's variable from what we've formulated for them. And so that variation or inconsistency can create problems, not only from a nutrient target standpoint, but then again, the fact that they're typically sorting against fiber, sorting for more energy dense components, that can have a negative impact then too on the rumen environment. And we have some good research to back that up, both at a cow level and herd level, showing that the more we see of that, the more kind of negative influence we see on milk components and efficiency of production, both within cows as well as within farm.
So it sounds like these behaviors such as sorting and slug feeding are undesirable. So are you able to touch on how cows develop these types of feeding behaviors and if there are any management considerations that might increase the risk of the cows developing these types of behaviors?
Yeah, so it's interesting. And again, I think a lot of these behaviors are influenced by the way cows are fed and managed kind of currently, but we also know that these patterns can actually be instilled at a fairly young age. And we have done some research in this area, and I think we still need to do some more to really fully figure this out. But we have some pretty good evidence that these patterns of eating, like just meal patterning, sorting behavior, even the kind of the diurnal, so within day patterning of when they eat, are learned or affected by things that happen to those animals early on in life or already during the milk feeding phase. And so we have research that we did a few years ago looking at this from a number of different perspectives. And what we found was that some of the management practices that we do for calves and young heifers can have a kind of a carryover effect on their feeding behavior and kind of the learning and development of those. And just an example of that. So providing, say, diets to calves and young heifers that are, say, easily sorted. And what we've found in some of the projects that we've done on that is that when we provide those calves the opportunity to sort a diet early on in life, and they learn how to do that, they actually get kind of reinforced in that behavior. And that carries over time in those animals. And same thing goes for meal patterns as well. We've been able to demonstrate that kind of that slug feeding behavior might be actually a response to the way that those animals were, say, fed early on in life. Some work that we did with just looking at milk feeding a calf, so providing calves limited number of meals per day in small amounts actually correlated with those calves having larger, say, grain meals at those times. And so we can probably, again, in that study, we weren't able to follow those animals long term, but could almost assume that if that kind of pattern gets reinforced and continues, then those animals might continue on with those same types of eating patterns over time. So just from a practical standpoint, then having calves fed more often, milk meals could potentially have positive impacts, not only on kind of satisfying the natural behavioral kind of desires of those animals, but also then translate into longer term benefits on their, say, behavioral repertoires. And we have some other data from some other studies we did a number of years ago too, looking at how we provide, say, feed components to young weaned heifers. And so many farms, after calves are weaned, say, off of milk, they're eating starter and they get introduced to forage if they haven't been already. And in a lot of cases, that forage may not be mixed, or we'll provide the grain separately from the hay or even top dress it on top of that hay. And what we found in some of that work is that when we feed calves that way, they tend to go to the feed bunk and they tend to consume all their grain fairly quickly, particularly if there's any level of competition, say, at the feed bunk, and then pick at the forage for kind of the remainder of the day. And what we demonstrated in some of that work is that when we did that, as compared to, say, animals that were provided their grain and forage as a dry TMR mixed together, we found that those calves that were fed their diets or their dietary components separately not only exhibited that slug feeding type response where they go to the bunk and eat all the grain really quickly, but those animals actually became more competitive at the feed bunk. And then when we switched those animals after a period of time onto a common diet, we observed that those animals actually retained those same feeding behavior patterns. And so we actually induced the learning of that slug feeding just based on how we fed those animals. And so definitely, yeah, there is opportunity based on the way that we kind of, particularly the way we manage feeding early on in life, to have a potential impact on the development and carryover of these meal patterns and eating behavior patterns.
That's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that, Trevor. So knowing that there are management practices that increase the risk of these feeding behaviors, is there any way that we can manipulate feeding behavior through feeding management?
Yeah, definitely. And so, as I mentioned, we have some opportunity there to potentially maybe shape the behavior of the animals early on in life. But I would still say, based on our research and from my group and from many others, we probably have even a greater impact on those behaviors through kind of present day management, whether it be the feed that we provide, the management of that feed in the bunk and even the environment that we provide that feed within. And just some examples of that, again, the feed in itself. So not every diet's going to be consumed the same. And so the type of diet we provide, the level of forage within the diet, the chop length of forage, all those kind of things are going to have pretty large, significant impacts on the eating behavior of cows. And specifically, we know that, say, higher forage diets and those that are processed well from a particle size standpoint, those diets that, they're probably going to be more conducive to better eating behavior patterns, less slug feeding, less sorting. But when we get into diets that maybe, say, lower in forage, or let's say we have variable and long particle size, those diets may be slug fed more, they might be more prone to sorting. And so then we need to think above and beyond the diet itself and think about how do we manipulate that behavior beyond that through kind of the management of that feed. And that's where feeding management becomes really important. And I mentioned off the top, just the way that we manage feed delivery and timing of feed push-up, and even time that the bunk is full of feed is going to be very important from making sure that those diets get consumed as we put in front of them and in a manner that's good for those cows. And so, again, quite a bit of research that's being done looking at how often we feed cows. And so we know that for TMR diets, and even more so for diets that are component fed, the more often we get that feed in front of the animals per day, the more kind of even distribution of consumption that we see throughout the day. And we see slower rates of consumption. We see smaller meals more frequently throughout the day. And we also see less feed sorting. And that's kind of a physics exercise where if you have smaller individual piles of feed available for those cows at different time points of the day, that's going to be sorted less than, say, one large pile of feed that, say, is delivered, say, once a day to, say, a group of cows. So not only are we creating more or more even distribution of intake through the day, the consistency of what is actually consumed in terms of the composition of that diet gets improved by doing that as well. Now, again, increasing feed delivery frequency might not be feasible or possible in all situations. And then in those cases, then the insurance of good feed access through making sure feed is pushed up and making sure that we don't run into situations where the bunk is empty becomes even more important. And so again, having feed pushed up frequently throughout the day, and particularly overnight hours where in many farms we might not have as much, say, labor availability, becomes important for making sure that that feed is available to those cows whenever they go to the bunk. And if we don't do that, what we often see then is when we do push up feed, as I mentioned off the top, those cows come running to the bunk because they're hungry, and they start to slug feed, and that creates kind of a cyclical pattern in these cows. And so we want to really eliminate that from happening, making sure feed's always there, and then also feeding for sufficient levels that we don't end up with empty bunks for any period of time during the day as well, because that then is going to kind of perpetuate that behavior as well. If the bunk is empty for any period of time, then the next time those cows do get feed or new feed is delivered, then their next meal is going to be that much bigger. And so we need to make sure that we do a good job from a feed access standpoint to really eliminate or prevent that kind of behavioral response from occurring.
Yeah, those are all really great points, Trevor. Thank you for sharing that information with us. So shifting away from feeding management, what about pen management? Are there any considerations for how you group cows and how that can influence feeding behavior?
Yeah, and again, beyond just the feed itself, and I mentioned already, the environment that we provide feed within can have a significant impact there as well. Probably the biggest factor contributing to that is competition. And so competition between cows can elucidate that kind of feeding behavior response, particularly creating situations where we see, slug feeding, even displacements at the feed bunk, which will then typically result in cows wanting to consume their feed faster, particularly at times of the day when they want to be there, like when feed is delivered. And so then we need to think about, well, what is elucidating that competition? And so that can come from a variety of different things, including stocking density. That's probably one of the biggest things. So the stocking density of the pen or crowding of the pen. And so anytime that we overcrowd that pen, and we have, and we know that from a freestall perspective, if we put more cows in the pen than there are free stalls, there's going to be a negative impact on the lying time of the cows. The lying time of the cows goes down on an individual or an average individual basis. And we see the same thing when we overcrowd the feed bunk. We see the amount of time that on average individual cows spend there goes down. And sometimes that maybe correspond to a decrease in intake, and particularly our most vulnerable animals, our close-up cows and fresh cows. But we may not always see that in all situations, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the cows don't change their eating behavior. And so what we'll see is they may maintain the same level of intake, but they are spending less time there, which means they're eating quicker. And so they end up having larger meals, quicker meals, things that, again, aren't necessarily conducive to good rumen health and efficiency. And that's why we've even, in some of our research, demonstrated an association between, say, stocking density at the feed bunk and greater risk of, say, milk fat depression because of that change in eating behavior of the cows. And so that becomes quite important there to consider as well. That competition may also come from grouping and group structure, right? So when we have, say, mixed parity groups, we have younger animals, 2-year-olds, first lactation animals, mixed with mature cows. We even at stocking densities that are not overly high, we still may see that competition arise because of that parity difference, size difference between those animals. And so in those cases, the younger animals may be forced into situations where they have to alter their eating behavior to get, say, access to the bunk when they want to, or try to consume feed as quickly as possible in kind of fear of being displaced. And so in those situations, density becomes even more important, because as we overcrowd those pens, then the negative effects really get compounded, particularly on those, say, more timid animals, those socially subordinate animals, which tend to be those younger animals. And so if we have opportunity to create groupings based on parity, that's where we really see the benefit, because we see not necessarily for the older cows, it doesn't necessarily make as much of a difference, but for those first lactation animals, there's truly a benefit for them. And we see the same things also, we see an influence also from other kind of pen level management factors. For example, if we have cows that are, say, forced to stand for long periods of time, and a good example of that is, say, a holding pen time at a milking parlor. What we've seen in research is that the longer that time period is, that then influences the time budget of the cows in other areas. And so if cows are having to spend long periods of time, say, in a holding pen waiting to be milked, and when they actually get back to their pen, it's going to change their time budget, whereby they may spend less time lying down, which we know is problematic from a lying perspective, a rest perspective, a rumination perspective. But they also then may change the time that they spend at the feed bunk. And so they may end up changing their feeding behavior patterns as well. And so important for us to make sure that, cows have the time that they need to devote to those various activities that they have to do throughout the day, to eating, to resting, to drinking. And then we're not forcing them to, say, spend too much time in kind of non-active activities like waiting to be milked, because that can have a negative impact then, say, on their other behaviors. And I think probably maybe one other example there is just even group composition in terms of how and when we group animals and how often cows, say, are moved from one pen to another. We know that each time we move an animal into a new pen, it not only has a negative influence on that individual animal, but may influence the animals that pen that she's introduced into. And so that typically comes at the expense of often the eating behavior of those animals, particularly in the first couple of days after, say, introduction to that pen, where we see those animals being displaced not only from the feed bunk, but from other areas of the pen. And so for her to maintain intake during those time periods, she needs to then alter her intake behavior. And that can often lead to kind of negative feeding behaviors or more slug feeding, eating faster, those kind of things. And so, again, trying to find ways to mitigate that stress and minimize the number of times that we're, say, moving animals and regrouping animals, particularly, again, around those vulnerable periods of time, late gestation, early lactation is very important from that perspective.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. I think it's fascinating how much management influences the cows and how much we do can really influence what the cows do with the feed that we provide them with. So I think those are really great points. So for some of the producers listening that maybe haven't thought too much about feeding behavior, are you able to provide them with a couple of take-home messages as we wrap this up?
Yeah, I guess probably as you just kind of mentioned, probably the biggest thing is that it's not just about what we feed cows. And so again, diets are very important and the composition of those. But really, if we want to take full advantage of the nutritional value that we have in the feed that we give to cows, we need to make sure that they're eating that feed in a manner that's good for them and eating it as it's put in front of them, right? So again, good, consistent eating patterns, many meals, small meals throughout the day, limited sorting of that diet. And so that in itself might be influenced by the feed, but even more so is going to be influenced by, as I mentioned, early life management, making sure that we're not starting calves and young heifers off by teaching them how to slug feed, right? Just based on the way that we feed and manage them early in life. And then as we manage those cows as mature animals, that we make sure that we're not enhancing any of those kind of negative eating behaviors by the way that we manage feed. And so making sure feed is provided ideally often throughout the day, making sure it's continually pushed up and available, and then also minimizing competition within pens, social stress are going to be hugely important for promoting good eating patterns in dairy cows.
Well, thank you very much, Trevor. We certainly appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today, and I think our audience will greatly benefit from the information that you shared. Any questions, please be sure to check the episode notes or reach out to one of your local CCE dairy specialist or Pro Dairy.
Thanks for listening to this Herd Health Troubleshooting episode. You can find more episodes like this one on the CCE Dairy Educator channel on SoundCloud or on the Pro Dairy website, along with many other resources.